Welcome to Municipal Capitalism. This is Josh. In this episode, we're joined by Austin Cole to discuss the three-part series, Black African Liberation and Grassroots Economies, beginning with part one, Rootedness for our people, our economies, and our liberation. We'll start with Toni Morrison's concept of rootedness and its impact on how Cole has come to understand urban planning and economic development. From there, we'll dig into strategies of counter-war and how fascists are shaping local policy and how BAP-Baltimore is building alternatives from the ground up. We'll examine the threat of elite capture and the strategic use of municipal power, how engagement with the state can enable collective self-determination rather than dilute it. We'll explore how expanded notions of self-defense, the Black Commune, as theorized by George Jackson and Orisanmi Burton, and the four principles guiding grassroots efforts towards that vision. Finally, we'll sit with the questions of mass consciousness, what it demands of us now, and how we might cultivate it together. If you like what we do, want to support our ability to have more conversations like this, please consider becoming a patron. You can do so for as little as $1 a month. We bring you these conversations totally independently with no corporate state or grant funding. Now, here's Austin Cole discussing some of his work. So we are here with Austin Cole. We're discussing your three-part series, starting with Black African Liberation and Grassroots Economies. Part one is Rootedness for our people, our economies, our liberation. So I'm going to just start off by allowing you the space to talk about Toni Morrison's concept of rootedness and how you're like borrowing from it with this piece.
Yeah, so I think rootedness. For me, I came across this piece, Toni Morrison's Rootedness, Ancestors Foundation, which is an essay that late Toni Morrison wrote, I think in the 80s, maybe like 1984, around there. It's a pretty short essay, so I definitely recommend people check that out. And she's really talking about a few different things, but first she's kind of focusing on her own writing and kind of answering this question of like where does she get almost like the material, or what stories is she interested in telling with her various, different fictional stories, or kind of any of the works that, or any of the writing that she does. And what's critical to that, the name of the piece kind of implies it, but Ancestors Foundation as foundation. And I think what I interpret that to mean, or sort of how I think about that, and what Toni Morrison describes, is this idea of like having a conscious historical connection to ancestors. And I think what she says is, accepting sort of both the supernatural and the practical, and that both of those things are rooted in the real world at the same time, specifically for Black or African peoples, right? And so really this idea, and I think, folks like I grew up in Ohio, but my family is all from the South, from Mississippi and Alabama. And I think, other folks that are part of, who are African or an African diaspora also have kind of like I think there's a similar understanding that, as Toni Morrison describes, like we are practical people, right? While also, and concerned with like the everyday, concerned with the material realities, while also understanding that there is this sense of like supernatural, and the spiritual, that is also just as real as the everyday, right? And that may not come through in everything, but I think at least, as far as, the folks that I grew up around, and the people that, my family in particular, I would say, they're very religious. And I think a lot of that comes through with Christianity, but it goes beyond, religion, right? In that spirituality. And so that like concept of rootedness, I think what Toni Morrison's saying there is that in her stories, she's telling stories from that perspective, right? From the perspective of Black or African people. And so Song of Solomon is one of the ones that she mentions in that piece. And that's one of my favorite, novels. And I think it's like such a phenomenal story. It's about community and place and sort of heritage, and how things from one generation sort of show up in the next generation, and sort of shows the coming of age of this boy and then man, milkman, and it has a lot of supernatural elements, and then also just a lot of really realistic elements about, in this kind of fictional place. And so for me, that understanding of rootedness as kind of a concept, but then also thinking about how a worldview, or, some people would say like a cosmology, like a way of understanding the universe for Black and African peoples, how that actually plays out in a place, or in space, or in space time. And so for me, I really love Song of Solomon for that, and it kind of opened up my eyes there. And so when I read Rootedness, and I got to give a shout out to Darius Simpson, who's an organizer and poet, and I think who I followed on Twitter and have been in a little bit of communication with, and I've seen this piece because it really unlocked, I think, this kind of essential thing around like what some folks might call blackness or being black or like culture or whatever, but in a much more real and kind of generative and productive way for me. And I think it really connects as well with Rodney's notion of Marxism and African liberation, and Cabal's notion of like culture as a material condition and as a total way of being, and even kind of in some ways like Fanon's like national consciousness. I think there's some aspects of that there as well. And I think that it really is kind of this idea that like these two things, or these different things of the ancestors, so your history, your own people and the material there, as well as the spiritual elements or supernatural elements, are not actually competing forces, but are actually part of, each of those are part of the everyday, and they play different roles, right? And so that is not to say that like supernatural comes above material, or that on a day-to-day basis we should be primarily concerned with those things, but just the acknowledgement that those are also valid ways of seeing the world and understanding the world, and that they all exist together. And so for me, that is where this concept of rootedness is important. And then I think, or where it comes from. And I think where it's really important is and I know we're going to talk more about planning and development and get into all of that, but before, I think what's really important about rootedness is that it kind of shows us that if this is something that Toni Morrison is saying about rootedness, what is everything else that, or what are the ways that we are operating rooted in? Because she specifically talks about fictional stories, but when she's talking about this in terms of fiction and in terms of things as well, like how she approaches feminism and how she approaches sort of political questions as well, I think what's really important is that the rooting is in Black and African peoples and in our everyday lived realities, as well as our broader social understanding and social position in the world, versus sort of Black and African peoples taking this foundation of sort of a more white supremacist colonial foundation that dehumanizes us, that treats us as separate peoples, right? And then trying to build a foundation on top of that, right? And so if we can understand why it's important to be rooted in something that is actually rooted in our own humanity, in our own understandings of the world, and not that those are singular, right? Like we all can have different understandings of the world, but I think that's really critical, because if we don't actually start to approach and understand this like rootedness, that we are rooted in some type of soil, right? It just may not be one that's like generative for us to explore and to engage in like our full humanity, then we really can't go anywhere, right? Without repeating those cycles. So I think that for me is like really important in rootedness. And I guess I would also just mention, even for me, like shifting and talking in terms of like Black and African, and I may say that many times, I think that's something that is part of kind of the terminology that we've been using in Black Alliance for Peace. And also for me, it's important to kind of highlight both and to be rooted both in the continent of Africa and the history and, African culture and understanding, and seeing, Afro-descendant, quote unquote, people as African peoples, right? But then also to understand, what it means to be Black, and what Blackness means, and seeing that as, potentially a political category, and what that means for like our position in society and our shared struggles for liberation. So even in like that terminology, while it's not all perfect, I think that there's an importance of like rooting us in terms of how we align with those ancestors, with those places. And even for me, like bringing in a lot of quotes and bringing in a lot of folks, who maybe are not brought into like urban planning and development, is really critical as part of that rootedness.
Yeah, certainly. And I appreciate that. You bringing up like the uses of like Black African, for example, because I've had that debate quite a few times now, just as someone who uses it regularly in writing, and like people asking me like, why do I use that term, for example? And honestly, I don't think there's a perfect term at all, really. Like there's arguments for each and every one, I guess, but I do appreciate like that narration of like it being a means by which you actually name, you know what I'm saying, the continental connection to Africa, of course, but then also naming like the means by which we've been blackened, right, by chattel slavery, if that makes sense as well, and kind of marking our own relationship to both like land and to labor and to capital, if that makes sense. And I think Black African manages to do that. And I think that I appreciate that explanation. Is basically what I'm saying. Yeah, on that concept of like rootedness, though, you connect it to urban planning and economic development. So how do you see these two working in tandem?
Yeah. So this was really a lot of what one of the, I think, kind of the origination of even thinking about these pieces or thinking about some of the work that I was involved in that led to these pieces was really just this both like discomfort with identifying as like an urban planner, or thinking about city planning and being in a program around city planning and as well as like a program on business as well, and thinking about what it means to talk about economic development and urban planning if like my main focus or my main goal is, Black African liberation and liberation of all peoples, right? So that was, really, I think the finding this point around rootedness or this concept, I think was really an inflection point for me in my thinking about, how I even identified and then what it meant to apply that as like a framework and to any of the work I was doing. But I guess before I go in like even more depth into how I see them working in tandem, I know urban planning and economic development are things that people have definitely heard about, right, or heard thrown around, but obviously have a ton of different definitions. And I don't sort of claim to ever have, a singular definition, but I do see planning as this sort of middle ground between state power, market relationships, and people and play space and the resources, that we either produce or consume. And it's also, I sometimes describe myself as a planning practitioner, right? And so it is a profession as well, that emerges in the global north and at a local level has been like primarily through government agencies, private sector developers, consultants, nonprofits, things like that, right? And I think typically the idea for planners is this idea of like we want to have good cities or we want to have good, communities or regions, right? And we want them to work well. And Jane Jacobs is like a big more on like a like liberal planner, who said like, planning is focused on like how cities should work, right? And how they can be good for people and businesses, right? And so there's this idea that like planning, at least for me, planning is, how we actually conceive and make our social relations and our built environment reflect whatever values or visions we have about, about our society. And typically the way that's done now is in this very kind of bureaucratic or technocratic way, right? That supposes that that says that there is no political orientation, right? That is neutral and all these things, right? Obviously we know that's not true. And you don't even need to look at like urban renewal and other things like that, but there's many examples of why that's not true, right? So, and then, that's kind of planning and how I see planning at least. And then there's economic development, right? And so, economy is a big thing. And I kind of think about it as just like how we engage in the processes to provide for human life, or to go into like economic exchange. And obviously that has to do with like industrialization, technology, technological advancement, organizing productive forces and developing all those things, is part of that. And so I really draw a lot from Rodney, with that and thinking about Walter Rodney, thinking about, economic development and thinking about how Europe underdeveloped Africa and then Manning Marable, how, capitalism underdeveloped Black America, and understanding that development processes are tied up in slavery and colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, the degradation of our natural environments, the disruption and dislocation of people and cultural and social systems. And so all of these things, right, sort of show that capitalist development, is not the goal for Africa or Africans, right, as Rodney says, and as many people as well have said, Wallerstein and a bunch of others have kind of laid that out in different ways of like this world system approach to development. But, you know, for Rodney, and I agree with this, is that like development should be focused on like Black self-determination, right? And that includes like political power, self-defense, thinking about culture and ideology, you know, having control over our destinies. So while Rodney is like a little bit focused, I think a little bit traditional, and like Peter Hudson talked about this a little bit too, like Rodney was really groundbreaking, but also is like kind of surprisingly conservative because he still maintains this idea like economic development is really about the productive forces and all that stuff, which I'm not saying it's not, but I'm saying more there is more to that, right? And Rodney kind of says that too, but I don't think he, especially in how Europe underdeveloped Africa, he doesn't like lay that forward, right? In some of his other writing, he says more about it, and I think expands on it. But I guess like bringing this back to rootedness, right, and thinking about why, all like I said before, if we don't understand our rootedness and what we're rooted in, then we like allow ourselves to be rooted in some other tradition, some other, you know, relationships, some other histories. And those are histories of exploitation, of enslavement, of genocide, right? Of destruction and dehumanization of our peoples and our cultures and systems. And so it's really clear for me that like economic development is rooted in that, right? Is rooted in that exploitation, in imperialism, in neocolonial, in colonial and now neocolonial rule, right? And planning has sort of emerged, you know, in largely in the late 19th and mostly in the 20th century as a way to kind of like manage those relationships, manage that in the built environment, right? And then sort of as this reform basically, right, and has taken on sort of a new face of the same way to extend that exploitation and oppression, right? But obviously managing it in a way that is that allows for some more order, right? Some liberal order. And so like in thinking about all of that stuff, I think when we think about it on planning and economic development on a local level, for me, it's really important also to, especially in the U.S., to think about sort of like the plantation economy, right? And I think this is something, again, like Peter Hudson, I think pointed out to me at least, that there's some like, and he's written about this a little bit with the Caribbean, but there is like a lot of co-opting of this idea of the plantation, and people kind of take this, you know, it's like much more on a cultural basis, or sort of this like almost like Black nationalist approach, like, oh, we're like on the plantation, right? And I'll say that sometimes myself, right? And I think that's there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but I think when it gets exported to like um urban planning, to these sort of more liberal nonprofit areas and stuff, it gets divorced, it gets turned into like racism, right? And just like the plantation as like a sort of not as a like physical manifestation and as a reminder of slavery, but divorces it from like the actual economics of plantation economies and the ways that those have created the system that we live in now, right? Because we still in many ways live in a plantation economy, right? And so it's just that has shifted, right? And it's maybe we don't physically live on plantations, but those relationships have just sort of morphed, right? They haven't really changed fundamentally. And so I think George Beckford is someone who writes about this. I believe he's well, he's Caribbean. I don't want to say the wrong island. So I know he's a Caribbean sort of development economist, right? Who's writing in like the 70s and 80s, and wrote sort of about the plantation system and how the plantation system obviously is this unequal economic relationship, but also creates cultural underdevelopment, creates like super rigid social structures, undemocratic politics, destroys social responsibilities and social cohesion, forces conformity on people, and then also creates this demoralizing impact on people's motivation, that there is no, like, that they have to sort of work, as that work is like a burden that they have to do in order to live, because they have to do this burden for other people, not that work can be a way of actual self-actualization and can be contributing to like a community's entire well-being, right? And so obviously, like, within that, the plantation is a thing, right? It is a place, right? It's also a system, right? And then it's also like an economy, and it creates the way that we relate to the world. And specifically, Beckford talked about the U.S. as like U.S. South as a sub economy, right? As like as a sub-plantation economy because it's not, the entire country is not a plantation, but it has the U.S. South, right? And so I think that relates as well to this idea of the internal colony that, Robert Allen talked about, William Tabb, many other folks as well, like with the Black Belt thesis, like Harry Haywood and, even Claudia Jones talked about that, extended that as well. But really this idea that like within the U.S., there is this structure and this plantation sort of structure where there's this colonized population of Black Africans, right? And then there is also that is laid on top of this colonial superstructure and colonial capitalist imperialist superstructure of the entire world, right? And so that is both like a material fact that is economic, but it also creates the politics around that and also creates this ideology, right? This kind of like ideological superstructure that I think that Beckford talked about is like premised on Black dispossession, right? And so like regardless of where you are, what state you're in, whether it's local, whether it's national, whether it's global, Black dispossession for, white capitalist accumulation is sort of the law of the land, right? And is like the way that the system functions, regardless of whether you're on a plantation or not, right? And so when we talk about things like urban planning and economic development on a local level, they're certainly not talking about this, right? For the vast majority of places, even those sort of all these things that emerged from 2020, all these different forms of, planning that people have put sort of a Black face on, they engage with racism, they engage with, what they call structural racism and all this stuff, but they don't really go into like, we actually need to change this superstructure and how are we doing that, right? And how can we even do that? And that's, I think, primarily because, they're kind of bought into planning as a profession and as a function, or economic development as a function of like these sort of elite folks, right? Or semi-elite folks, or, petty bourgeoisie. And so for me, thinking about moving beyond that, that's where I think rootedness really comes in, because right now planning and economic development, so, when it comes to that, is really focused on like, how many jobs can we create? What is the racial wealth gap? What does development look like? How can we bring development to these, poor communities, or to these underdeveloped communities, or to these people that just, are so, it's very kind of white saviory. And so for me, breaking out of that requires being rooted in something else, right? Requires being rooted again in our, our ancestors, in our own sort of our everyday realities, and what we may want and need and desire as Black African people, and figuring out like how we even get to a point where we know that, right? And so for me, understanding that like sort of, you don't necessarily need to throw out every single tool of planning and economic development, but you do have to sort of grapple with the fact that the way that things work now is not, obviously not set up to support liberation, right? Support the liberation of our peoples. It is set up to sort of reproduce this plantation system, to reproduce this hierarchy at a bunch of different scales, right? And so that's where, for me, the rootedness in this sort of like foundation that thinks about the material and the productive forces and all this stuff, but also thinks about the cultural, the spiritual, and how people are relating to one another, to nature, climate, land, all of these things, right? And how all of that is not separate, right? It's not either or. It is, we need to actually be thinking about all of this at the same time. And so we need to actually, break or end planning as honestly, as a profession, or as a profession in the way that it works, because it again serves to manage this hierarchical system. It doesn't serve to actually free us from it, right? Or to allow our liberation. And so like there's some folks that talk about, Amartya Sen talks about like development as freedom. And I think that's like a super liberal version of like freedom and capabilities that's kind of really premised in this liberal individualism. But I think there's something there in terms of like people's capabilities, people's like mentality, people's kind of collective morale and spirituality, and those things like we can't necessarily throw out, right? Just because they're not kind of hard and fast, economic measures. And so there's, for me, that's like where this grassroots economies piece comes in, and thinking about like how do we build economic organization, economic initiatives, projects from the local conditions that we have, while also understanding the kind of core contradictions and manifestations of like systems of oppression at a global level, right? Understanding that like the economy is kind of this made up thing, right, at a global level and all this stuff, but it also is very real, right? And that even though, we may not necessarily care about what's happening on Wall Street on a day-to-day basis, right, it does affect our lives, right? And so for me, thinking about like how do we kind of hold this kind of way of drawing economic organization, initiative, activity, connection from the grassroots, right? From the people, that is based in the people and based in actual in the masses of our like Black African people, but then also, with connection and solidarity with all colonized and marginalized people. And so thinking about rooting ourselves in the people, right? And I think, like I've talked a lot about Toni Morrison and rootedness, and I didn't talk about it as much in this, or really at all in these pieces, but there's also this Clyde Woods, who's a late scholar, talks a lot about this idea of blues epistemology and being rooted in South and Southern, in the Southern tradition of Black African people there, and thinking about the blues and kind of Amiri Baraka's, blues people and all of those things. And he really kind of says a really similar thing, and this has been important for me as well, as I thought more closely around like geography and economic development and urban planning, is like, for him, blues epistemology is like a way to like embody this like materiality of expression of Black and African people, right? And thinking about like, how do we think about the fact that Black African people have been, enslaved, kidnapped, stolen, from our cultures and our people, taken, enslaved, and brutalized for so many years, while also being able to be resilient, to be resistant, to fight against that, to have our own forms of knowledge creation, our own forms of relating with one another. Not to say that they're perfect, right? But understanding that there is like an ethic and a materiality to Black and African peoples, like that we have this culture that is much more than, the culture that is commoditized and sold to us in, music, TV, movies, in popular culture and all these things. And that it is like not premised on Eurocentric models, right? And it also is not saying we reject everything that is European, right? But it's saying like we have the capacity to sort of define from our own people and from our own means what it looks like to have an economy, what it looks like to have a culture. And so that's sort of where I'm trying to get in and trying to sort of think about how do we root ourselves and how do we both understand the importance and the critical aspects of the core contradiction of imperialism and manifestations of capitalism and patriarchy and racism and all of these things that in white supremacy that all factor into this, while also understanding that we do have to kind of chart a path in the conditions that we are in now, right? And so there's not like another world we can fly to and make that, brand new, right? We have to work with what we have right now. And so that's kind of the attempt to like to be rooted in something different, while also understanding that we have to make progress and we have to fight and struggle in the everyday right now.
Yeah. So along that same vein, I want to talk a bit about the strategies of counter war, right, that you speak of. Because something I've been talking about with folks locally is how fascists are already at the town hall, right, in school board meetings, and participating in the propagating and opposing both parents and administrators of their ideology and informing low-level policymakers in ways I think the former left has largely failed to, if that makes sense. So I'd like for you to talk a bit about the work that BAP-Baltimore, or in other obviously regions as well, is doing locally to forge an alternative there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's it's a really big challenge, right? And like, even I talked to my sister and she has 3 kids in school and in elementary school, and talking with like the local school board there and the other things. It's like such at every level, like you said, there is so much of the ideology being informed by, fascists, by folks who are kind of hell-bent on, quote unquote, taking their country back. I guess to start thinking about strategies of counter war, one of the things that's really important is understanding war, right? And understanding what I mean by that, at least, right? And so I'm, part of Black Alliance for Peace. One of the things that we say, is focusing on ending the war on Africans, domestically and globally, right, here and abroad. And so we don't sort of say that, just to say it, right? And I think a lot of people recognize this, right? We are at war, right? And people have been saying it more often now because of the repression that we've seen with, the Palestine solidarity movement and encampments on campuses and, the Uhuru 3 and other things like that, right? In other areas of like clear state repression, right? But I kind of come back and I'm borrowing this or utilizing this from Orisanmi Burton, but I come back to Eric Williams, right? And Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, where he kind of describes slavery as war, right? It is war on our bodies, on our peoples, on our communities, on our social systems and cultural systems, right? And so if we understand war in that way, right? If we understand war not only as the as individual acts of violence, right? Or a series of acts of violence, but actually as a structure and as conditions that are imposed upon us, that are, that result and are like a form of oppression against us, right? I think that is really where counter war comes from, right? And so if you think about, the Palestinian people, right, and that the genocide after Al-Aqsa flood last year did not come out of nowhere, obviously, and in fact, it's just a stage in the Nakba that is ongoing, right? A stage in the war against Palestinian peoples, right? And there it's really easy to see, right, because it's incredibly violent, it's incredibly destructive, incredibly clear, if you know anything about that place, right, and you're honest about it. But for us on a day-to-day level here in the US for Black African people, right, we, as I say in one of the pieces, we constitute an internal neo-colony, and many people have talked about that before, and that is a form of warfare against us, right? It is conditions of war against us. And so what are those conditions of war, right? It's economic warfare, it's militarism, capitalist and racist violence, right, by pigs in our neighborhood that are occupying forces that, brutalize and murder Black and other marginalized folks. It's ecological devastation and the climate crisis, right? It's psychological warfare. It is all the ways that, welfare has restrictions on it. It's sort of the taking away of, child tax credit. It's, private equity companies coming in and, gobbling up all the affordable housing and then trying to resell it or building, shitty housing for folks. And so all of those I kind of see as conditions of war, right? And so where are we now, right? In terms of thinking about that is we exist in this internal neo-colony, right? Where we are dominated politically, economically, socially by not only white capital and financial capital, right? But by the Black kind of misleadership class or the Black faces, right? That are sort of the first layer of defense of the elite and of the capitalist class, right? Especially when we talk about cities. There are so many Black mayors in large cities, right? But rarely and basically none of them represent the wants, desires, needs of the masses of Black people, right? And so, Robert Allen talks about this in Black Awakening Capitalist America. William Tadd talks about it in The Political Economy of the Black Ghetto, and I reference both of those in that piece, right? And so I won't go into too much detail on that, but I think that is like, those are the conditions that we're in, right? That is how we are existing right now in these conditions of war. One thing that, Ruth Wilson Gilmore point out, and she's not the only person to point this out. Many people have said this, but really kind of talks about the political economic superstructure that we currently exist in is a result of the failures of, radical action and the counter-revolutionary success of the post kind of 1968 and the post 68 movement. And I bring that up because Orisanmi Burton talks about that as well, and talks about the Long Attica Revolt in his book Tip of the Spear. And I think he's been on the show, and he's, really, that has informed my thinking on this a lot as well. And that's why I bring in the notion of counter war, right? And like how we think about counter war. And so when we think about counter war, in my mind, it's not to say, violent retribution, right? It's not to say that we are trying to get back at the oppressor, right? And while I'm not going to like exclude armed resistance, right, and definitely support, resistance by any means necessary and available, right, I think it is critical that we know that counter war is actually, as Orisanmi Burton talks about it, is war against war, right? So it is war against the conditions of war. And that's why it's really important to understand war as like a condition that we are under, right? And it is a war that we did not ask for, right? It is not that we set out to engage in this war. This war has been imposed upon us, imposed on our bodies, on our communities, on our neighborhoods, our cities, our organizations, right? And so counter war is the method, is the campaign of waging war against war, right? Of ending those conditions of war, of ending, the conditions of all the things that I just mentioned, and the systems of oppression. And so when we think about that on a day-to-day basis, again, it's not the goal cannot be to go into the town halls and stop the fascists by applying what, democratic strategy is. And like, there's folks like Pritzker in Illinois, who's the governor there, and other folks. And, a lot of like Democrats and neoliberals cheer them on. And they're like, yeah, they're like doing what the Republicans do, but a liberal version of it, right? They're doing gerrymandering, but like for liberal causes, right? So we support them, right? And obviously we don't support that generally, and would never call myself a liberal, right? Or think about, I'm not allegiant to the Democratic Party in any ways, but I'm bringing that up to say like that a lot of times when I think we think about strategies of how do we take power, they can fall into the thing of like, well, we need to engage in this like war strategy to overtake this, the system that I mentioned again is designed to produce these unequal outcomes, this injustice in all these ways. And then we're surprised when, if we do win and take that over, that we're not able to actually change anything, right? Because it's always going to be much easier for fascists to take over the policies of, to inform policymaking, because we live under empire, right? We live in the U.S. empire, the most propagandized place in the world, the heart of global genocide, and an entire imperialist system that is premised on our own dehumanization, and the destruction of this planet. And so anything that sort of falls in line with that fascist worldview and that neoliberal worldview, right, is going to be much easier in these systems that are, neoliberal, that are designed to promote to continue the colonization of our peoples, right, and to stop mass power from having, a real chance, right? And so while that's kind of depressing, maybe, right, and a little bit, and that's not the intention, right? The intention is not to be depressing. The intention is to be clear, right? To have clarity so that we don't make mistakes, right? And that's not to say that, again, I'm sure we're going to talk about this later, but that's not to say that you can't engage in battles at, town halls, or you can't engage in battles at, the school board, or, the city council, or ways that can inform those lower levels of policymaking. But just to understand that liberation is not going to come from those things. So you may get tactical victories through those methods, right? But we're never going to get sort of anything that resembles liberation by just taking over those things and operating them as they have been, but with people that agree with us, right? Now, all that being said, is there a role in like minimizing the harm or not allowing fascists to destroy institutions that support life? Yes, absolutely, right? But again, I think that, and that's where BAP-Baltimore and, work of Black Alliance for Peace and many other organizations come in, right? And so, Black Alliance for Peace is an alliance of organizations and individuals. So when I talk about BAP-Baltimore, or talk about BAP Chicago, or any of these other areas where we have, a presence in a city, it is like we do have campaigns, right? We have, Shut Down AFRICOM campaign. We have, which is focused on AFRICOM, getting the U.S. out of Africa. We have the Zone of Peace campaign, which is focused on, U.S. Imperialism out of the Americas and creating true, durable peace in the Americas. And we have the No Compromise, No Retreat campaign, which is specifically looking across, the U.S. and ending militarization and racist, white supremacist rule and abuse in the U.S., right? And ending this, imperialist system as it shows up in the U.S. But we do that in many different ways, right? And there's organizations and individuals can sort of choose how they work within the framework of Black Alliance for Peace, right? And so for Baltimore, I'll say there are, organizations that are working there that are going to look different than organizations in Chicago or in New York, or in Boston or in Atlanta or Dallas or wherever they might be. But Baltimore, I do have, even though I'm based in Boston, the Boston area, I do work, closely with folks who are in Baltimore and have, come to some of their town halls. And one of the things that I think is really critical there is around, again, this idea that we don't sort of forfeit arenas of struggle in this kind of counter war for no reason, right? And just say, well, that there's no progress to be made there, so we're not going to engage in the city council or whatever. But that we need to create a base, one, and that we need to create a politically conscious or politically educated base from which to move, right? And that is really, really critical. And so some of the stuff that BAP-Baltimore is doing, in this stage is one around consolidating an alliance of different organizations and individuals, right? That includes things like, obviously political or radical political organizations, political parties that are not bourgeois political parties, anti-imperialist political parties, other sort of social organizations or collectives, churches, right, that are rooted in sort of a liberation. I won't say liberation theology because it's not that, but in a liberation struggle, student groups, right? And going out, engaging with those organizations, and then as a group or as individual organizations, canvassing, doing, presentations in schools, in churches, in other community spaces, right? Holding town halls. And so they have like a monthly town hall at Baltimore where they bring in topics around, militarization in the Americas and in, the United States and on the continent, right? They bring in things like people-centered human rights and concepts that people may not be familiar with and many, many other things, right? And so I think one of the really critical things to understand with that is that, a lot of people say like, well, we need to figure out like how we can make imperialism relevant to, people in Baltimore or in Boston or Atlanta, right? How can we make capitalism or white supremacy or all these things, relevant to people? And I really don't like that question. And I've said it myself, right, too. So I'm not sort of shading anyone who says that. I don't think it's necessarily like the most unfair question to ask. It's just a very common one that I think gets away from the point, which is that people already understand imperialism. People already understand white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, right? Now, they may not use those words, they may be invested in those systems while they also understand them, right? So they may be some discomfort there. But principally, the challenge for us, as Black, radical revolutionary, Black African radical revolutionary organizers, scholars, educators, whatever, activists, whatever we may be, is to show people that there is something that can be done about those conditions, right? So that people don't fall into this place of, well, yeah, of course, like I know that this exists, but like there's nothing you can do about it, right? Or, the best we can do is vote for the imperialist that looks like us, right? And not actually destroy the system that is harming us, that is, killing our people, destroying our people, and committing this slow genocide against us, or accelerated genocides in Palestine, in the Congo, and in other places, right? So I think that aspect is like very key to BAP-Baltimore's work of like, we actually there's no like dumbing down of the work, right? But there is understanding where people are at and being accessible to them and going out and finding them and connecting with them. And then when people come to you, sort of bringing them in and building a base, building consciousness and education and building organization, right? And so when we say things like join an organization, right, I think this is what we're talking about, where we're not just saying, join any organization and do whatever, right? Obviously, you have to meet people where they're at, right? You have to do things that engage people. You have to think about ways of also taking care of people while they're in spaces, right? But fundamentally, we have to organize around our values, our principles. And if our value is liberation, we have to obviously think about new ways of being, but we also have to understand where we are, right? And I think my comrade in Baltimore, Erica Keynes, has been really, really fundamental in helping me continue to come back and focus on that of like, it is critical to be clear, to understand what we are facing. And that's why I harp so much with these strategies of counter war on understanding the war against us, right? Understanding our condition of neocolonialism, because if we misdiagnose the condition, then we're not going to be able to apply the treatment or the remedy, right? We're not going to be able to understand what we need to build to move forward, to think about liberation. And I will say, coming back to planning and economic development, there's an intentional and in some cases an unintentional misdiagnosis of what the problem is, right? And a lot of that comes into these, this coloniality, this thinking that certain people, deserve a certain level of dignity and other people deserve a lower level of dignity. Some people are more human than others, and that's baked into our liberal system. Into liberalism is literally from the beginning is baked in this idea that white governance, self-governance, and white property ownership is a right. And, that is built off the destruction, the dehumanization, and the degradation of not only non-white human beings and colonial subjects, but the planet as a whole, right? And so, again, when we are thinking about, strategies of counter war and the work that's happening locally to forge an alternative, it has to start there, and then we meet people where we're at, but then we move, right? And we move together. And again, coming back to rootedness, it's, figuring out what is that foundation? Because for me, again, with my family, my mom's side of the family is my mom's from Greenville, Mississippi, from the Mississippi Delta. Like, I never heard her say the words capitalism, imperialism. I never heard my grandma say that. I grew up with both of them. I grew up in like the black church, and, people were never talking about those things, right? But people were certainly talking about corporations exploiting our people in our communities. People were certainly talking about, the owner of the, business that, half of the people, half of the men in my church, the factory that half the men in my church worked at, moving those operations to Mexico and sort of creating a massive amount of unemployment in the town that I'm from, right? People were certainly talking about all of these other forms of oppression, right? They just weren't using those specific words. And again, coming back to that is we don't need to reinvent the wheel around those things. We don't need to like talk patronizingly to people and act like they don't understand their own conditions in the world around them, right? What we do need to do is think about how do we chart that alternative? How do we bring people together and form that alternative together as well, right? And then lead with these strategies of counter war as I'm thinking about them, right? How do we kind of give people the tools to then pursue our own liberation and struggle for our own liberation? And doing that, in one of these ways, of these kind of six strategies of counter war, or, it could be in many others, right? I think there's many other things, and pretty much nothing I said is really new, right? It's more just combining some things that maybe aren't oftentimes combined together. So that's kind of how I see those alternatives forming. It really is this, dialectical relationship between what are the people, desiring, wanting, needing, and then what do we know strategically we need to attack, defend, and kind of create based on where we're at and where we intend to go.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that leads us to my next question, which is if you could talk a bit about the processes like organizations and communities can resort to avoid like elite capture, right? And this is something I feel most struggle with, considering that it is almost impossible to avoid it outright, especially considering, as you mentioned in the third part of the series, how important it is for a strategic use of the state, for example, especially municipal resources and power. Does that make sense, right? I feel like anytime one works with or alongside the state, they're at threat of being captured, right? And they're not even a critique, of course, or saying that we should, like, that no one should ever do it at any other point. Because again, it's almost impossible not to work within these avenues, to advance struggle. So how do you envision that engagement with state and municipal processes might help enable collective self-determination and not stifle it ultimately?
Yeah, I think that this is like one of the most, for me, I agree. It's one of the things I struggle with the most. It is one of the hardest pieces, even when you're doing like less radical stuff, right? Even if you're just trying to like do some basic things of like getting, food, like feeding people, right? Or educating people, or around healthcare, right? Basic healthcare. I think this elite capture comes in and thinking about that. So I mean, I guess to start off, and I will say as well, like to be transparent and not even necessarily like admitting anything, but just to be honest about like I think this is critical because we're all sort of, while we are fighting against this white supremacist capitalist system, we also are existing within it, right? So, I just, graduated from grad school recently. I've worked in a lot of different areas in the private sector, in, philanthropy and nonprofit spaces. Very shortly, small, like short stints in like local government. And even now, like a project that I'm working on around climate justice is, have funding from, from the federal government, right? It's not a ton, but it's a little bit of funding there. And so I think this is something that I'm like on a day-to-day basis, negotiating, fighting with, like, I have, a meeting like next week with some, local municipal officials who we're like have to partner with on some stuff because we're talking about energy, right? And so like you have to partner with the state when you're talking about, or at least engage with the state when you're talking about stuff like around energy, right? Because it's so regulated. So I'm not saying anything around elite capture to come from this place of like, certainly not to poo-poo anyone for working or think or having to negotiate this stuff, right? But what is really critical is that and Olufemi Taiwo talks about this and has a book called Elite Capture, right? I think it's really important and kind of goes into elite capture and identity politics and how identity politics has been taken away from its sort of like original conceptualizations and kind of perverted to support elite capture and through like identity reductionism and through these other kind of forms, right? And so, what elite capture is, right, is this kind of phenomenon, and I think it's like one of the core tactics of neocolonialism, right, of neocolonial rule, is that you basically get, the black bourgeoisie or petty bourgeois or black elites, right, who dominate, the local systems, right? When we're talking about Black African folks, right? Obviously, this applies as well to other groups, right? And even, not around race, right? It applies to class and applies to any group of people, right, that are trying to advocate for anything or work towards anything. But it basically allows kind of, some advantaged elite to like steer the resources and steer institutions to support their wants, needs, desires, right? Or to support their aims in opposition or against the aims or needs or desires or interests of the entire group, right? So the mass, in this case, the masses of Black and African people, right? And so we see that on a local level, we see that nationally, internationally. And I think in planning and development, it's like so endemic to so many processes, right? And part of that is because like on its own, any profession, anything that sort of relies on experts is super susceptible to elite capture, right? Because you're saying, well, these people know, and so we're going to follow their advice, right? Or this person is the representative of this group, and we're trying to just pull together a bunch of different representatives. And so even when we spend a lot of time in like city planning school and in city planning processes, or even in philanthropy when I was working there, when you're talking about participatory processes, you're talking about democracy and all these things, people, oftentimes really, really well-meaningly want to bring in the voices of people, right? They want to have participation. They want to change how things are done. But what oftentimes ends up happening, you have this air of democracy. You have this sort of like facade of democracy that is creates that helps push forward, this neo-colonial rule where the actual accountability to the needs or the desires of the masses of people are ignored, right? And instead you sort of defer to a single person or a few people. And so what kind of Olufemi Taiwo talked about is like, we don't need to be like in the room. We need to have different rooms, right? We don't need to have like the one person in the room who's going to represent us, because that is how elite capture happens, right? We need to actually change how these things operate completely, right? We need to change the playing field, right? Or the place from which we are engaging in politics with the state, right? And so I think why participatory practices I highlight, or so-called participatory practices, why I highlight those is because they actually, I think, are worse in many instances than non-participatory ones, because again, they give the facade of accountability, right? And they give the facade that, the people have been consulted, and they allow, the government or the state, the corporate actors, right, to go on and do what they wanted to do the whole time, while also now having sort of a rubber stamp from one representative. And so that's really how, like, that's like the dominant kind of trend in planning and in economic development now, right? And a lot of it also just comes from this broader culture of individualism here, also a culture of entrepreneurialism, which was really consciously pushed forward after, the 68 to 71, 72 period of revolts. And, Nixon talks about, made Black capitalism like a national policy. And so all of these things are intentional, right? And being pushed forward to have us rely on methods that support, or that are susceptible to, I should say, elite capture, right? And so why is that important, or like what can we do about it when we engage with the state? I mean, I think it's a huge challenge, right? Like I said, I think, like you said, Josh, like you're never going to be fully protected from elite capture, right? It's never going to be the thing where we figured out this system that like fully it's foolproof, right? But I think one of the things that I think about a lot, and I don't know that I don't think I've mentioned it yet in the work. I didn't mention it a ton, except for, in this upcoming one that's coming out. But a lot of the work that I'm, laying out here is also informed by, organizing, and research in this, master's thesis project and organizing that I did both here in the U.S. and then also in Cuba, and with folks in Cuba, who are sort of grassroots, Black African organizers there. And one of the things, and I studied abroad in Cuba almost 11 years ago, right, as well. So spent a decent amount of time there, and learning about Cuba and the Cuban Revolution and being in community and organizing with folks. And I think one thing that's really critical is like we talk about elite capture because we're so focused on democracy and so focused on like very few methods of democracy, right? And so when we talk about democracy here in this country, obviously we just had an election, right? That was sort of a clown contest, right? And that is kind of electoral politics is like 90% of how people think about democracy. And then the other 10% is like these kind of city council processes and town halls, right? And there's very little else, right? Maybe I would say that's 9%, and there's like 1% other things, right? And so in Cuba, the way that democracy plays out on a day-to-day basis, yes, the Cuban Communist Party is the, official party, right? And you can't run for national office if you're not part of the party, right? But the processes, even to get to national office, have democratic processes within them, right? Of election of those representatives, right? And then more importantly, on a day-to-day basis, it is not sort of only about these kind of singular meetings, right? Or these singular town halls or city council sessions where there's 2 hours or 3 hours for people to hear from the entire community. And then, you get this form of elite capture that basically ends up with, the needs and the desires of the bourgeoisie or the elite element of those groups are the ones that actually get taken into account, because those are the ones that, the government is willing to connect with and respond to, right? In Cuba, right, and actually before I go back to Cuba, you see, like right now we see that with the City of Yes stuff in New York City, right? And I'm working on a project in New York, and you see that's not related to this, but you see like how this sort of perversion of this idea of like, well, what do the people really want, right? And Eric Adams, we know, is, definitely, maybe the poster child for Blackness leadership. But we see this idea that anybody that opposes the City of Yes, which is sort of the YIMBY, yes in my backyard, policy that supposedly is gonna bring affordable housing, but is actually designed, to allow developers roughly free reign, so that they wanted to make sure that developers can, make money off of, the need to build more housing, right? And so you see in the city council sessions or any of the community sort of forums that have happened around City of Yes, Eric Adams is saying, everybody supports this, Black, brown community support this, and it's like the white radical people who are gentrifiers who don't support this, right? And then you have, folks like Leah Goodrich, who's, a representative and is a housing activist and organizer as well, saying no, that is absolutely patently false. Like my constituents who are Black and brown and working class folks oppose this because they know that the problem is not that there's not enough housing. The problem is that there's not enough affordable housing, and just building new housing that's also not really affordable is not going to change that, right? And so, but those things are said in those meetings, and then they're basically ignored, right? And you're going to get a few representatives that are going to come up and say, okay, we support the City of Yes, and then it's going to end, and it might move forward, right? Unless there's enough opposition to it. So in Cuba, you see a thing like the recent Families Code, and the way that process worked is that Cuba was sort of doing a new constitution, right? And they were having a referendum around that constitution. There was a really big challenge around ending a ban on like gay marriage, instituting rights for LGBTQ people that were more advanced, right? And doing all these things. And so they actually took that out of the constitution because that was something that as they were doing the constitution process, there were there was a lot of controversy around it, right? And they said, okay, let's take this out and let's do the Constitution. And they did that, I think, in 2021. They ratified it, or 2019 maybe. And then and then they decided to do this separate process for the new families code, right? So they could actually dig into that. And what that included was 70,000, community forums and town halls around the entire island. It also involved, I think they ended up revising over 50% of the family code because of those town halls and because of those changes. Many people from, the women's associations, labor associations, family and youth and student associations all got to weigh in and provide their comments and actually go through a democratic process of changing that, right? And that might seem like a lot. And, you say, well, you couldn't do that's an entire country, like 70,000 forums is a lot. Well, Cuba only has a population of 11 million people, right? New York City has a population of over 8 million people, right? And I think like the City of Yes forums are going to be below a dozen, right? Number of actual forums, right? To do this major overhaul in zoning and all these things, right? And so when we think about what democracy actually means and how do we avoid elite capture, I think it's things like that where we have to think about, the structures and the processes have to change. And if the government isn't willing to do that, because obviously, why would this capitalist imperialist government do that and submit themselves to real democracy, right? We have to kind of take that charge on our own, right? And move things forward in that way and think about, as Black Alliance for Peace says, and is taken from Ajamu Baraka, think about people-centered human rights, right? Think about, how we get our human rights is by struggling for them, right? And by breaking from this Eurocentric framework and actually fighting and demanding what we want, right? And one of my comrades, Nick, has said that as well, says like we need to build a culture of demanding more, right? And so I think that that's really critical to avoiding elite capture is actually organizing and being able to demand more, being able to say like, well, if the state isn't going to support these processes, then we need to be able to fight for them. And we need to be organized enough to fight for them and defend them and sustain them, right? And so I actually think it requires a totally new framing of what it means to engage in participatory planning or in economic development or through this process of building grassroots economies, understanding that the revolution is not a static thing, right? The Cuban Revolution did not happen and end, right? It is ongoing, right? And the same with many other systems, right? These systems, these processes of social transformation are ongoing. And I think that just to end one like really tangible thing, I think that, I learned actually in grad school was we did negotiation simulations, right? And, when you're doing a simulation, obviously it's not real. So whatever, you can take certain things with a grain of salt. But really, when it comes down to it, yes, some people are better negotiators than others. You can maybe win a little bit here or there on the margins. But really what determines the outcome of a negotiation is called the BATNA, right? The best alternative to negotiated agreement. And that means that what are you able to force, right? Or what is the status quo if a negotiated agreement does not happen, right? And so if you're negotiating with the state or you're negotiating with corporate actors, right? And the status quo has no sort of downside for them, they have no reason to negotiate with you. And so engaging with the state is probably kind of foolish, right? Unless it's sort of to sustain your own survival, right? And I won't, shade anyone for doing that because obviously that is critical, right? In guaranteeing our community survival. But if we don't have an alternative, if we don't have an ability to force the state's hand, right? At minimum, if you look at labor unions, right? When do labor unions win, right? When they're able to have a strike threat, right? And I was part of, grad student union labor processes, right? And organizing around that and, testifying in negotiations and doing all these things. And when did they decide to sign the agreement? When a credible strike was about to happen, right? And so we need to figure out ways to avoid elite capture, to avoid these things. We need to figure out ways to have mass-based power that can actually, if at minimum make a credible threat to the status quo, the system, and hopefully actually strike a blow against imperialism materially, right? Whether that's stopping work, right, and a general strike, right? Whether that's through blocking, access to areas, right, to buildings, right? If you look back at basically every actual tangible material gain that folks have gotten, and not even historically. Even I can think of some that have happened in the last 5 to 10 years. They actually happened and shifted because the people were organized and said things like, "We're not going to let you into this hospital to close it down. So we're actually going to lock the executives out of the hospital, and the nurses are going to go on strike, and all of these things are going to happen unless you come to the table and negotiate. And then also, here's our plan, and here's our ability to follow through on that plan and be organized to fight." Right. And so I think it's important that we understand that like negotiation, these sort of technocratic dealings, and all of the smart people in the world are not going to make the state or corporate actors do things against their interests, right? What does is, and what stops elite capture from being viable is having a organized, active, and aligned and unified base, right, of folks, and that includes individual people, but also includes organizations and institutions. And so I think thinking about that and thinking about this idea of demanding more, being able to demand more, and being able to struggle for that and commit to that is really where we should be kind of focusing our attention, because that then allows us to engage with the state on our terms, right? And think about how do we bring in the state if we need to or if we have to. One, that's not a default, but then two, if we do need to or we do have to, or if it's strategic, that we are doing so on our terms, and so that we won't leave ourselves susceptible to these forms of capture.
Yeah, definitely. And I actually love your expansion on the concept of self-defense. And I would love if you, well, I was going to read an extended quote from you, but I would just allow you the ability to expand on it here today if you're able.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is, for background, like I was saying, this work was, a lot of this stuff came together in some form or another through doing this kind of like organizing, and then, community engaged, I guess you could call it, kind of thesis project, and working with folks. And when I originally did that, I actually only had 5 strategies in there, and self-defense wasn't one of them. And then when I was going back and writing this article and trying to sort of write it for this purpose and think about, engaging, Black African radical folks, I think I was really like, this is missing something, and self-defense just kept coming back up. And so, yeah, for me, I think self-defense, obviously, like I said in the piece, it has to do, with, again, with this rootedness, right? A rootedness in our own traditions, in our own survival, right? In our own ability to take care of ourselves before sort of we were convinced by this kind of like neo-colonial state that we could just rely on this system. And so when you think about organizations like the Deacons for Self-Defense, and like the Lowndes County, Mississippi, and the Lowndes County Freedom Organization in Alabama, and obviously the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, who all of those were sort of like building off of each other and in certain ways, right? Whether actually building off each other or borrowing each other's kind of iconography, or even some of the same individuals. And you think of SNCC, right, which was super important to the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, and eventually to Black Power and Kwame Ture, and that entire tradition, right? Armed self-defense was always a part of that, right? Malcolm, Martin, they spoke about different things, right? But they both had armed self-defense, right? They both had people with them guarding that had weapons, right? Because we live in a white supremacist, violent capitalist world, right? And as people that oppose that, they were susceptible, right, to violence, right? And so they needed that self-defense. And so all of those things are critical. And like I said, with regards to Palestine, when we think about resistance, right, that is like one major aspect of self-defense, right? The ability to engage in armed resistance, right? But we don't have to just think about Palestine. Again, we can think about our own histories here in the South, right? And also in urban areas with things like the BLA and other organizations, right? So there's plenty of examples there, right? And I think it's critical. And I think folks that I'm organizing with, connecting with at various different levels, we're all kind of talking about that now, right? Because of the oppression, because of how clear it's been that we need, to look back at some of those histories of self-defense, and then also think about, automation and facial recognition and all of these things, and technology and tracking and all these things that have made us less safe, and have to consider how we defend ourselves in a different way, right? So that is like critical, and I think probably sounds familiar to everyone, right? And when people think of self-defense, they probably think of that. Maybe they also think of martial arts or boxing or individual self-defense. So all those things are important, right? And I think all those things are really critical. But what I'm also trying to bring in here too is this idea that how we think about the systems that sustain our life, right? Sustain our livelihood, food, water, shelter, energy, community, right? Those things, sustaining those things, protecting those things, ensuring that we have, access to those, assets or systems or institutions, right? Or physical locations is also self-defense, right? And that I think is, again, not necessarily something that is new per se. And if you look at, Gaza and the north of Gaza that has been cut off from food, for, I believe, over a month now. And obviously all of Gaza, even before the sort of the genocide that has been the acceleration of the genocide and Nakba that has been the response to Al-Aqsa flood. Even well before then, Gaza was, said that it would not be livable in the next few years, right? And so when we talk about self-defense, again, it's not just on self-defense, it's also our ability to sustain our communities, to provide for our communities, to care for one another. So I think though all of those pieces are really critical. And if we're not thinking about those things in self-defense, we are, one, doing a disservice to our people, right? To our neighborhoods, to our communities, and our institutions. And then two, we're also missing an opportunity because I think self-defense is something that really resonates with folks too, right? Like, again, I'll say at least definitely, in the South and the Midwest, where I spent, most of my upbringing, at least, and my family ties are, I think that resonates really heavily, right? Especially with Black folks, especially Black African folks, especially with, other, I would say like other folks who face colonization and marginalization. And so if we're not talking about self-defense and we're not framing some of these things as actually like self-defense, then we're not, one, not fully being honest, but we're also not taking advantage of the fact that that is something that resonates with people. And so for me, that's something that I've started to try to talk about a little bit more, both at a micro level, even in, nightly organizing meetings, right? When we're talking about more day-to-day stuff, as well as with these kind of bigger, headier concepts, and even in some of the more projects that I'm engaged in that are in more of like a nonprofit framing of like, okay, how are we organizing and thinking about energy, thinking about housing, and thinking about self-defense, right? And some of the folks that are involved in those processes, I think are really that really aligns with how they understand, the world, how they understand their communities, and the kind of active violence, and again, the war that's being perpetuated against them and against all of us. So I think for me, self-defense is really critical to have that. And one example of an organization is like, there's this organization that was formed in Colorado around eviction defense, and they were responding to all of these evictions that were happening because of during the pandemic, during like the beginning of the pandemic, right? If you remember that, or just after, and then also after these eviction or these housing protections went away, right? And so they formed to stop people from getting evicted, and there was lawyers and relatively liberal framing around that, but just trying to protect people to keep their homes, right? And then they realized, a couple years ago, that they needed to expand, right? It wasn't just eviction; it was all these other forms of predatory economics, right? And I was sort of helping them think through that and kind of anchored on this idea of like community economic defense, right? And their community economic defense project. And so I think, again, it's economic and it's also other ways. But I think thinking about how do we defend our people? How do we sustain a community? How do we keep our people alive so that, as the Black Panther said, we can have these survival programs pending liberation, right? We're never going to get the liberation or even be able to fight for that if we aren't able to keep our communities, in place and together and alive, and then hopefully becoming healthy, right? So I think health is a big aspect of self-defense and much beyond individual health, but really the collective health of our people is really critical and a prerequisite, honestly, to these other broader forms of organizing. Or at minimum, we don't have to yet be healthy to fight for revolution, right? But that also has to be a goal, right? And there's a reason Fannie Lou Hamer talked about being sick and tired, right? Of being sick and tired. And so I think that is something that, was true, is true, and will remain true going forward, that if we cannot defend ourselves and defend our communities collectively, right, then how are we going to be able to fight for liberation?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I want to talk a bit about like the concept of the Black commune, which you borrow in a couple of your pieces from George Jackson and then Ori, and you're discussing it, and what they discuss it in the context of the prison rebellion, right? But you're kind of like discussing it in a broader context as well. So talk about your takeaways of it and how you envision, what I'm saying, one might have developed it outside of that context, I guess you can say.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess for me, like you mentioned already, I'm thinking about, George Jackson and Orsanmi Burton and talking about the Black Commune. Um, really is this idea of, this um, space or ability of maybe temporary, maybe permanent autonomy and liberation, right, in the context of oppression, right? And specifically with both, George Jackson and Nori talking about that in the context of the prison, and thinking about the Black Commune as a grassroots alternative, really, to this destructive system, right? And so the creation of that Black Commune would kind of bring about the destruction of the current system, right? And in order to have that, we would need, to destroy that. And so in Attica, during the Attica Revolt, right, in August of 71, Tommy Burton describes that as sort of the rebels there as forming what could be called the Black Commune, right? Or could be established as sort of a temporary form of a Black Commune, which again was a form of counter war, right? And is not premised on violent retribution, right? The vast majority, all but four of the 43 people who were killed during the revolt were killed by the state, right? But it's based on like new forms of humanity, based on self-determination, right? And based on that ability for, Black African peoples to define what their life and what their self-determination and what their liberation might look like. And so for me, when I was reading Tip of the Spear, that really resonated, and obviously reading Blood in My Eye and other, folks that have talked about George Jackson's work in that way really both motivated me, and I think again brought some clarity. I think there's one really specific passage in Tip of the Spear where, where he kind of relates a story from one of the folks we interviewed about this one of the rebels, being after they've taken over, the E block or the area of the prison where they took over during the revolt, they were outside at night and he could see the stars for the first time in years, right? Because he hasn't been able to be outside at night. And that it was this sort of communal process with the cosmos, right? He saw the stars and he felt sort of this overwhelm, this kind of connection with the entire world, right? And that for me, I've had to read that like 12 different times, right? Because it just like was bringing up a lot of emotion and a lot of clarity for me. And I think, one of the quotes that I really liked and the way that Ori describes it is like the Black Commune as a space-time of ecstasy, joy, love, intimacy, pleasure, and collective Black radical becoming, right? And so I think that aspect is really critical, right? Is that, and I think that's highlighted in that excerpt that he has about the Attica rebel who's looking up into the stars, is that it's actually about this kind of Black radical becoming, right? In this space where all these other things are possible, but that is not to lose sight of the fact that all of that is only possible because they fought against harm, the oppression, the systemic and structural violence that was being heaped on them every day, right? And so again, this idea of counter war against war, they did not perpetuate that, what, you might call violence, right? But they did not perpetuate the system of oppression, but they actually took the opportunity of, taking over that area of the prison and to form a different way of being, right? And they kind of define that fully, right? But the idea is that there is a possibility of like Black radical becoming, right? And I think that is really critical to the Black Commune and to countering the conditions of war, the conditions of neocolonial war. And I think one other aspect of the Black Commune that is critical is like that is a space of power from which they were able to make both their minimal and their maximal demands, as Ori talks about, right? And says, the minimal demands were things around, prison conditions and, and improving those things, right? And then the maximal demands things around the destruction of the prison system as a whole, right? And being a change in the conditions that create incarceration, right? And create mass incarceration of people. So those things could not happen if the Black Commune, if they had not created this sort of space time, right? So it is these sort of headier concepts of joy, ecstasy, love, intimacy, pleasure, and becoming, but it is also a real fact of like having control, collective control over a space or over a time period in order to make those other higher things possible. And so that's where I think this idea of like collective self-actualization is really critical, and how I kind of transport that from the prison context to the context of, our everyday lived realities, right? Because, you might say that you could have certain examples of the Black Commune, or of, the form, you might even say like Cuba as a nation like represents that, right? You might say Venezuela or the communes in Venezuela represent that, or the autonomous regions in Nicaragua represent a form of that, or even, other nations, right? You could even say like China's ability to fight for its own, liberation could represent some form of that, right? In some ways, right? But I think what's really I'm not sort of prescribing like what that has to look like. But I think what is really critical is this knowledge that it is a space of radical becoming, right? It is not predefined. It does potentially have certain principles that are going to uphold, human dignity, self-determination, and liberation, right? But also, it cannot only be those things if it is not also stopping or attempting to stop the harms of our current system, right? And of the oppression that we live under, and all the conditions of war that we live under. So when we talk about, prefigurative politics, or we talk about solidarity economies, or all these things, but we're not talking about ending the systemic harms, right? We're not talking about anti-imperialism. We're not talking about anti-capitalism and ending patriarchy and ending, all of these forms of oppression, right? Then we are really failing, right? And that's one of the most frustrating things for me when I see some of these things, especially, I think there's a lot of promise in certain aspects of like solidarity economy, especially some of the folks like, Cooperation Jackson, community movement builders, other folks that are taking sort of a more radical revolutionary approach to it. But if we're not sort of carving out those spaces or that ability to kind of, again, defend ourselves, to protect ourselves, and to eventually end those systemic harms, then we're really just creating kind of like pet projects, right? That sound great and have this really, awesome idea of Afrofuturism and all these great things that, we've seen in a million places where they really have like this, they're kind of taken over in a lot of spaces after 2020, this like Black radical ideals, right? But they're not actually premised in the ending, the destruction of those systems of oppression, which is critical to what George Jackson was talking about, right? Those forms of neo-colonial domination. So for me, the Black Commune in that way is really kind of a vision, and then also sort of a framework and a reminder of, as we're building things, right? As we're building these projects, how are we protecting them? And then how are we allowing spaces of radical becoming to enter into them? And so I'll use the example of, one of the folks that I talked with in New York. They're sort of building in Brownsville this area that is going to hopefully bring a lot of economic activity to the area, to like provide, opportunity, bring a movie theater to Brownsville, which like folks haven't had there. And not to say that that is like a perfect example of the Black Commune, but I think some of the ways they're thinking about it in terms of putting safeguards around who is able to own a business or own land in this area. And actually, this will be a collective project, right? A cooperative project, and the land under it, idea will be transferred to a cooperative or to a community land trust, right? And to be under cooperative governance, and that only certain folks are allowed to even sort of be investors in that, right? And those folks are also not just to say that those folks have to be Black, but those folks have to have accountability to actually people that live in these neighborhoods, right? And a certain number of folks have to be from that place, and there has to be community decision making within that process. Again, there's a lot of like ways that capitalism is a part of that, and that, in an ideal world, you might do things differently. But I think, again, this idea of the Black Commune allows us to think about, are we creating sort of a pathway to this Black radical becoming and protections from the systems of oppression that might seep into what we're trying to create, right? And so as long as we are keeping, as long as we're sort of building the ability to kind of continue to struggle against those things, I think that is really critical, and that is where we're able to see things like liberated zones, or we're able to see projects that can actually be potentially self-sustaining within the system that we currently live in. So for me, that's kind of how I see that work potentially developing, and thinking about this idea of Black autonomy, right? And how Black autonomy for me is not sort of this idea that like we are autonomous and we don't need to be organized, or we don't need to sort of like or it's anti-communist or anything like that. No, it's sort of recognizing that because of the oppression, because of the neocolonial conditions that we exist under, we have to be striving to create collective autonomy for Black African peoples right here, because we've been denied that for so long, right? And so any of the forms, the grassroots forms that we're building up, have to sort of be allowing that kind of radical or revolutionary becoming as they develop.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for that. It's funny, before I let you go, I do want to touch on this concept of mass consciousness. And I think that you brought up a point earlier in the call that I sort of kind of disagreed with. But I also at the same time I understand why you said it, if that makes sense. And it was around something along the lines of that like a lot of specifically like Black folks like understand like the concepts that we're mobilizing, right? They understand imperialism as a material reality. They understand patriarchy. They understand capitalism and things like that. And to some extent, I do somewhat agree with you because I do think that on as a baseline level, a lot of people do tend to have some level of conceptual grasp on like the conditions upon which they're struggling under, if that makes sense. Even if they're not politically or intellectually naming it, if that makes sense. But I also think that I don't think nothing, well, in this current moment, and yeah, like in the aftermath of Kamala Harris's defeat, one of the main things that I reflected upon in the last couple of months in seeing her campaign was seeing just how politically immature we are, and
Mm-hmm.
lackadaisical and confused I think we are. Um,
Yeah.
and of course, this doesn't apply to all of us, of course. Like, this doesn't apply to like all Black. I'm not saying that by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm going to focus specifically on Black African people in the U.S. context. That I think that we are really, really in like this moment of like ideological incoherency and confusion that obviously the Black petty bourgeoisie is only like intensifying, I would argue, because I think that's probably the primary like ideological function of like a neocolonialism, for example, is to confuse. And so I think there's so much like with that confusion has come in almost surrendering of one's own like political standing in some ways, for some way or another. I don't think people see themselves as political actors, for example, specifically Black people. I don't think people actively move in a way strategically speaking, like even again, I wrote a piece about this a couple weeks back, and I think, but it was something just about one of the main things I was seeing. Even if the solution was to like I could be convinced that like okay, not okay for me personally, I personally when I voted for her, right? Like I understand that, but I could be convinced of the concept that like as a strategy, Kamala Harris was the best option, right? Going up against Donald Trump. Like I can understand why someone would come to that conclusion, even if I disagree with it, if that makes sense. And I want to be very careful
Yeah.
why I'm saying this, because I want to like I think Kamala Harris should be like held accountable just as much as Joe Biden for the genocide that we're seeing today. And so I want to be clear about that, but also at the same time, like I can understand why someone would come to the conclusion that like, oh, I prefer her over him. Like that, it makes sense, right? I
Yeah.
disagree with it, but it makes sense, right? And then I say that, but at the same time, I'm also like seeing how it came about and how those conclusions come to, or how people come to those conclusions, right? And it comes in a very individuated and fractured way that we don't operate or like move or act politically in a communal sense, even on a local
Mm-hmm.
level. Like we don't make this decision. Like if that was the decision and that was something that we were going to do, it should have been made after. And that's why I say this after the commune question, right? Because like it should have been made in dialogue with other Black African people, other racialized and colonized people, and making this decision and then also bringing it to those in power, like, oh, if you don't do this, this, and that, you know what I'm saying, we won't vote for you. And then like and making that and then still making a collective decision, if that makes sense. But the thing is the fact of the matter is that we don't have that power. That we don't have that influence amongst, you know what I'm saying, the Black left is not like we've been relegated to almost irrelevance in the last, what, 50, 60, 70 years or so, right? So it's like, and that's why I'm intrigued by like how do we get to a place where we're not irrelevant, where we're not subordinated and just before we even get into the like you were talking about earlier, just well, not earlier, but just now you're talking about negotiations, things like that. Like we're not even at the table type. You feel what I'm saying? Like we're not even in the fucking room. The building, for God's sake, you know what I'm saying? And it's like, and then we're seeing this like this fracture amongst our own people, and we're seeing this confusion amongst our own people, and we're seeing our own people, right? Individual, ordinary people, the people who are coming out in droves about how they no longer support Palestine because Palestinians
Right.
betrayed Kamala Harris. These are not all state actors. These are not all CIA payroll. These are ordinary Black folks who are saying this. Some of them are Black petty bourgeois. Some of them are middle class. Don't get me wrong. Like a lot of them have like a very, enemy class interest, of course. But still, it's a lot of these people are just ordinary people who are saying these like bastardized and confused things. And these people are in our orbit. Like these are people that we love and know
Yeah.
and we occupy community and space with, if that makes sense. And like this confusion. And so like I try not to have like an idealistic understanding of Black folks or like even like a mystical or a spiritual understanding of Black folks. I understand like we exist in a way that is very complicated, in a way that is, to be quite honest with you, compromised. We are
Yeah.
compromised people. We are captured people, right? And then that has to take into consideration when we understand how we are moving politically speaking, and how we're moving in the way that a lot of millions of our fucking people are moving right now is in direct antagonism with the interests of like racialized and colonized people elsewhere. Does that make sense?
No, I mean, I think it was really well said. It makes a lot of sense. And I agree with you actually. Definitely your point around, or I definitely agree with you, but I agree with you, in terms of what I said earlier, it was definitely too simplistic, right? In terms of, I think if I would restate it, I would say something along the lines of like, people understand like the manifestations of those things, right? Or they see the manifestations of those things. They're not ignorant of them, right?
Absolutely.
But they don't understand imperialism, right? Maybe, or they don't understand the roots of patriarchy, and it's so tainted by our like liberal individualism that we've sort of even taken
Exactly.
racism,
Exactly.
patriarchy to mean like well, this person hates women, this person hates Black people, right? It's like, well, yeah, they might, but that's also not the point, right? And yeah, I think you're totally right. Like, I mean, yeah, I referenced your piece in the second part of the series and around abandoning a burning house, and I think it really, for me, like it resonates really strongly. Like I will always for some of the failings, or I don't even call them failings, just like blind spots or shortcomings of, Martin Luther King Jr. in kind of his tie to the United States of America and the way that he, understood that. Obviously, that one of the final things he said, right, to Harry Belafonte was, as you referenced in your piece, right, he's afraid of integrating his people into a burning house, right, and 60 years later, or 50 some odd years later, right, we kind of, we've regressed in a lot of ways in consciousness and in understanding, right? Like, so I totally agree with you in that point of view. And I think even, for me, it's been a shock. I'm never shocked by the really liberal people, but it's been a shock by some of the folks that were able to get behind, the Kamala train, where we were out, organizing around Palestine, talking about the end of U.S. empire, talking about all this stuff. And then all of a sudden, captured. And I think your point around like we are a captured people,
Right.
which I think your piece too is so critical to this idea of consciousness and to this idea of like the Black commune, right? Because it not
Right.
only like how can you create an alternative if you like they didn't create an alternative in Attica within their prison cells, right? Like under the watch of security guards in the normal day-to-day relationships of the prison, right? They had to take over physically part of the prison in order to even dream of what might become next, right? So I actually think it's a really good analogy. Maybe it's not something that I had necessarily thought of before, but I think that is a really good analogy around like we are captured, right? So how do we break from captivity, right? How do we break, we may do it individually. And this is actually something that, again, this rootedness, this idea of going back, reaching back to the scholars, to the organizers, the revolutionary fighters, like there's a reason that, we were talking before and before we started recording about Kendrick Lamar, right? There's a reason folks want us to look at Kendrick Lamar as someone whose political ideals we should follow and not look at Amilcar Cabral or Walter Rodney or any of these other folks, right? Because it makes us, it's easier to keep us in captivity if we're looking at celebrities and we're looking at folks who have no business actually leading us, regardless of how good or not their music might be, right? And how entertaining or not they may be.
Right.
But that's how that's how we've been engaged to look at consciousness. And, Malcolm X talked about that, obviously, right? About like when, white folks are in politics, they don't trot out, Mickey Mantle and Babe Ruth, right? Like, or Joe Namath, right? So it's, maybe now kind of Trump does, right? So maybe it's changing a little bit, but,
Right.
yeah, but I think to come like in all seriousness, that piece around mass consciousness and around this, I think one of the ways that we do that, again, I think we have to look back to our folks, right, to folks who did lay this out, right, but who have been sort of buried under the like mountain of liberal, reactionary, kind of identity reductionist forms of understanding blackness, right? So, Robert L. Allen, talks again, like in Black Awakening Capitalist America. I think every Black African person should read that book, especially in this current moment, because we are like we are living in the maybe second or third version of like that time period right now, right? So like it's very timely. I think folks should, obviously, I've mentioned Walter Rodney, I think, Toni Morrison's fiction. Obviously there's many, many other folks. I won't just start naming a bunch of people, but I mentioned George Beckford earlier, who talked about plantation economies, and this is one part that I haven't really incorporated into any of my work yet, but I've been talking about it and thinking about it with regards to him, with regards to folks like Lara Shihai, another, comrade, Palestinian comrade who, is here and is back in Palestine now. And even Ori talked about this around psychological warfare, right? And around understanding this battle for our minds, right? And for our consciousness. And so we have to think about the counter war in that way as well, right? Around consciousness building. And it's not about in the way that we've been taught to do it. And again, like I've worked in business, I've worked in nonprofit and philanthropic spaces. All of these places are using the same capitalist logics of marketing and outreach to sell you something, right? Regardless of whether they're trying to sell you healthcare or in services or sell you a new iPhone or sell you pharmaceutical drugs or whatever, they're trying to sell you things, right? And so when we repeat those patterns of like we're trying to do political education or consciousness building by selling people things, right? We're just like trying to make captured people slightly more conscious of the fact that they're captured, right? We're not actually helping them break from the captivity, right? And so I think that is so critical. And that's why I really love the idea of like abandoning the burning house, right? Getting out of this, right? Whether that is physically, whether that is psychologically, emotionally, politically, economically. And I'll say again, like looking to other examples in other nations, other places where people have done this. I think in Cuba, again, like with the folks in the Red Barrial Afrodescendiente, which is the Afro-descendant neighborhood network, that's actually visiting. It's a network in Havana of all these different Black African organizations, institutions, and activists who are building what I would call like Black autonomy, but with the socialist project of Cuba's revolution, right? Not against it, right? With it and understanding. And for them, they understand that like the revolution actually enables their ability to have autonomy because they could not exist in the way they do under a capitalist system, right? The forms of struggle, and like the ways that people are melding the spiritual, the economic, the political, the material around like land and around around religion and around all these different things and embracing their practices, traditional African practices of Yoruba and Santeria and all these things, right? I think is really critical, and that could not exist in a capitalist system in the way that it exists, right? So I think you're right in that, like, we have to figure out ways to help people and to help ourselves, like, escape this capture, right? And that has to be part of consciousness raising. And another group that's part of the Red Barriada Afrodescendiente is called Afrodiverso. And I've learned so much from them because they're LGBTQ plus organizers. They focus a lot on Black African trans issues, right? In Cuba, they were really instrumental in Havana in doing a lot of the work around the family code and around doing a lot of that consciousness raising, consciousness building. And what they do is that they are a unapologetically Black LGBTQ plus organization, right? And they are socialists, right? Or communists, right? And they do things like hurricane disaster relief recovery and supporting folks and going out and helping rebuild and housing people, right? They do things like helping kids with their homework after school, right? They do things like getting school supplies to kids at the beginning of every school, semester. They do things like connecting small businesses, which, in Cuba is different than small businesses here, and social services for people. And they also do drag shows, and they also create art, and they also do all these, and they engage with the communist state and other civil society institutions. But to say, like, one of the failures of the left here is that we so often we like put down things like that, or we separate these things, right? We say, well, you have to do mutual aid or you have to do political education, right? And like half the time we're not even really doing mutual aid, or really just doing charity work, which again is not bad, but like, call it what it is, right? And it is not separate from consciousness raising, right? If we're not doing those things together, right? If we're not actually seeing the material taking care of our people as part of consciousness raising, as mobilizing and organizing people, then we cede the ground to like whoever is providing the most entertainment, because we are like so propagandized and programmed to love entertainment, right? And again, I'm one of those people as well. It's so easy to distract me by like whatever's on Twitter, the beef with, like, I feel invested with like Drake and Kendrick Lamar, right? And I was bumping Not Like Us all the time, right? I've been bumping his new album. And again, that's not bad. It's not saying it's bad, but like, that is not where I'm getting my political, consciousness from. And I'm actually thinking about ways like to guard myself from the like psychological kind of consumer commodity focused warfare of these products that we are always being fed. So yeah, I think so much of this consciousness raising is like it's like, it can't just be sort of like school, right? It can't just be the sort of traditional ways we've been taught to like impart learning or to sell things to people, right? Like that doesn't work for like fighting this war again. And I think, yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that is like probably the biggest, honestly, that this like consciousness and cultural struggle. And again, many folks have said, but I think that's like the number one underlying.
It has to be. It has to be. Yeah, it definitely has to be, because I think it's like, even in my own experience, like I think just trying to get people like activated, right? Politically activated, intellectually activated, in a way that I'm even trying to like now, like with some, saying local folks is here, just trying to struggle through ways to like get people excited about like learning again. You know what I'm saying? I feel like a lot of people, like, I feel like school for a lot of people, like, people think of like reading and study in like a way that is like, it's so attached to like the bullshit that we were doing in school, right? So like people don't do it. You know what I'm saying? I know, when people I come across that like have not read a book cover to cover since they graduated, right? Or since they weren't school, even if some of them didn't even graduate, right? Some of them, like, even since they were in like organized, like, even saying institutionalized learning environment. And it's fascinating to me is like, I don't know. I feel like that's such like a major part of struggle, right? Such a major part of like, even just like in terms of just exercise, where like it's like a intellectual exercise that it's important, right? It's important to keep your brain functioning that way. And like even on a day-to-day basis, like reading makes me feel fulfilled, right? Learning makes me feel like it brings me, like, it gives me purpose. It makes me feel, I'm saying, something. And I think a lot of people are missing that aspect of their life. And I guess, as you're mentioning about the entertainment aspect, a lot of people that get there, they are being activated by Kendrick Lamar. They're not even activated into, like, and again, the activation is just simply, vulgar or whatever it is. But I'm saying like a lot of people are getting their quote unquote political education from these like bourgeois or petty bourgeois, like, you know, celebrity artists, for example.
Yeah.
And this is how we're getting people misled into, or, what I'm saying, or rather reproducing these logics of liberal individualism, because that's honestly what a lot of them represent, and that's the political ideology that Kendrick holds, for example. We were just talking about this before the call. I think that's that's like his probably his core belief, right? It's like his
Yeah.
personal self and his family, and it's like, what I'm saying, he doesn't even have like he doesn't like espouse any like communalism or like, what I'm saying, as a core belief system, if that makes sense. And if that's not his like main thing, and I don't know, it's a fascinating point to me, and it's interesting to say the least, because I think that like, back to the question of like even like mass consciousness, I think that like people think of these things as like a straightforward, that you're once, it happens once, or like there's like this one or second, this first or second event that happens, and it gets people to change their minds, and that it stays that way. And I don't think that's the case. Right. I think and that's why I'm so interested in this concept of like mass consciousness, because I think that like there's no way that like, I don't think, I think we're like being naive if we believe that for one, that we're going to change everybody's mind, for one. Right. But also for two, that like it's going to be a one thing, or like a single like straight line thing. And it's like there's so many forces pulling people away that we're seeing now. And I'm seeing, I was talking about this with a friend recently about like how like it's like a full-time job trying to keep my loved ones, right? My brothers and my sisters away from, what I'm saying, the vesters on YouTube, or the fucking incels, and the dating, the TikToker, what I'm saying, the podcast, the dating podcast, and things like that are so visibly, right, selling self-annihilation, that's selling, what I'm saying, individualism, selling, right, transactional relationships, and, what I'm saying, this very dehumanizing, and honestly, the way that people talk about dating now, it sounds like a fucking, honestly, the auction block, to say the least, right? But it's like the way
Yeah.
people thinking about these things, and it's like the people are being like sold these things, and again, it's just so many directions it's coming from: YouTube, TikTok, right, entertain, just like movies, and what I'm saying, and TV shows, and in books even, and it's everywhere, and people are being pulled in so many different directions, right? And it's like there's no coherent way, and it's like it's really a tall task, what I'm saying, to shift the culture, right? To get people actually engaged and interested in each other, what I'm saying, and actually willing to like live in, and struggle, and then obviously die even for each other, and for each other's being,
Yeah.
what I'm saying, not in the circumstance that they find themselves in today. And again, when I just say each other, I don't just mean even like your immediate neighbor either. I mean like people that you can't see, right? People hundreds of thousands of miles away who are subjects to your, what I'm saying, the bombs being dropped in, what I'm saying, with your tax dollars, for example. What I'm saying? It's a, yeah, it's a tall task, and I don't think there's a straightforward answer for it at all. And I'm not shaming anyone at all, but like I think that it's like we are in a moment that seems like, you know critical, I guess. And it feels like a lot sometimes like that we're not meeting it, with the
Yeah.
level of urgency and the level of like intensity that it requires, if that makes sense. And so, yeah, and that's a self critique as well, by the way, because of course I'm not doing enough either. So, but yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree as well. And I oftentimes, it's like this battle between like the urgency of the moment, the necessity of like long-term protracted struggle, right? And like the understanding that if we, as George Jackson said, like if we failed, like people are dying already,
Right.
who could be saved, right? Or people are being captured, right? Who could be saved. And so, if we fail to act, we can't do that. And I think that's where, like, I mean, for me, culture is like so critical, and working with folks in Cuba, working with folks in Brownsville as well, in New York, working, hearing and reading and talking with Musa Springer as well, who's someone who talks a lot about culture. And I think just has a new piece recently, maybe a week ago or so, on Hood Communist, that is really like good, I think, about a lot of pieces around culture that we're talking about, especially around celebrity. And that's like why one of one of the principles that I talk about in the thing around like a culture of liberation is so important, because it's like how do we sort of meet this moment and also understand that like consciousness is, like you said, it's not static, right? It is super dynamic. It goes back and forth. I know Tamanisha John, who's a professor, was on, I think, your live, like Millennials Are Killing Capitalism live, and talked about consciousness, like in Q80, Grenada, and the revolutions, and how those things are made and unmade, right? And how it's sort of a constant battle. And I think that's kind of in some ways, yeah, I feel like that ethic of like this constant battle of things are not, are never sort of safe. It's hard to draw that balance between like, how do you get people, how do you activate people and do enough to activate people? How do you also not scare people away, right? It'd be like the doom and gloom, right? And then also build a culture, because in some ways, like building a culture is a response to like imperialist colonialist systems, right? But then how do we build like a generative positive culture that is communal, right? That is about working from the grassroots up, that is about working together, collectively fighting and struggling, loving the struggle that we are in while also understanding that it is a struggle. Like all of those things I think are really challenging when you're also just getting, you're not necessarily, we live in a culture of like instant gratification as well too, right? So like this shit is like so well oiled here, it's like, so it's hard. How do we break out of that? And so I guess like the only way to do that is by continuing to do it, right? And I think there are like examples even of like, there's like a festival in Cuba that was started recently that is like about kind of a lot of these ideas of like black autonomy, black African autonomy, and self-determination and culture. And then when I was writing about it at first and thinking about it, my friend and comrade Darian Williams talked about the similarity to like Notting Hill Carnival and how Claudia Jones started Notting Hill Carnival, right? And then like you see in London and you see like the way now like Notting Hill Carnival, they're fighting over like if Africans can celebrate like Notting Hill Carnival too. And then there's a bunch of white people that go to Notting Hill Carnival. So it's not even like a Caribbean thing, but even before that happened, it was like totally commodified, right? And like totally all these things. And like while there still are some of the roots of like Caribbean resistance and black African working class kind of like culture and this idea of like a positive culture around being Caribbean, UK was like totally already captured by like this corporate, apparatus, or maybe not totally. I shouldn't say that because that's not fully true, but that there is like this sort of attempted corporate capture. So it's like this stuff is constant, right? But at the same time, so our struggle has to be constant, right? And so I think that for me is like, yeah, just so much of what you were saying like resonates. And luckily I'm like the youngest child, I guess, and I'm like one of the youngest cousins. So most of the people I'm like trying to deal with like jaded older folks who are like done with everything.
Right.
But but even like the students that I support and work with in school out here, it's definitely like a struggle to like try to like break through. So I do think the ways how we like figure out like that culture and that culture of liberation is like a really critical aspect to that. And I definitely don't have many and definitely not all of the answers there, but there's some folks here I think are doing some good stuff. Like there's some folks in this program called Heal the Hood that's in Boston that I think are trying to lead with that cultural piece around love and around coming together and supporting one another. And like, but I'll say it's really hard to do that and then also like maintain your autonomy as an organization and maintain your ability to not be captured and to actually, do things like keep your space, right? Be able to make rent and stuff, be able to do a lot of the programs that they're doing and also not burn out and sustain yourself. So yeah, I think that liberatory culture and that care that we can provide each other, those things are things, culture and care are both things that get co-opted. And sometimes I turn my nose up when people say that because of how much it's been co-opted, right? But that doesn't make it any less critical, right? To this like mass consciousness building, because if we don't have that, or if we're not building towards that, right, then anything that we do build can be torn down in a second, right? So and we've seen that, right? And we've seen, this happen, and we've seen what has happened, to so many people who were killed, so many of our organizers, leaders, freedom fighters who have been incarcerated, and many other things. So I do think in some ways it is it can lead to despair, obviously. But I also think like when we see that, again, when we understand the war around us, you can understand why this like consciousness is the way it is. And I like really appreciate just like your approach to that as well too, because it is like it's like coming from so many ways. So that doesn't make it any easier. But certainly, when people ask me like, okay, how do you like sustain yourself and stuff, it's like part of it is just like that. I think for me, and this is less, even for you, obviously, I think, part of it is things like, millennials are killing capitalism, is things like, the Black Alliance for Peace, other, local organizations, or, more autonomous collectives that like, that folks can be a part of, and, small group chats where you're like, where you are building and embodying those culture ideas, and you are talking about these things, not letting the psychological warfare of despair get to you. And then it's also like the programs out in the community. And I feel like when we're doing those things, we're in ways like maybe this isn't the purpose that we're doing them for, but we are like insulating ourselves from the stuff in here. Cause like, I woke up on November 6th or whatever it was, and I was like, oh, I feel like I don't want to tell people that like I don't feel bad today. Right. Because like it was just like this was not only expected, but it was also like, yeah, like this is what our nation is, right? I won't even say our nation. This is what this nation is that we live in, right? And so for me, that is like, it's potentially demobilizing, it's potentially depressing. And again, I'll come back to your point around like where we are, recognizing where we're at. It's tough because we're maybe at like the most captured and most like lack of consciousness that we've maybe ever been, right? Like, I mean, and like when folks were enslaved, like, yeah, there were some people that didn't want to break free, but like people knew they were enslaved, right? Folks in Palestine have such a high level of consciousness, right? They're because they are under, Nakba, and they've been going through this Nakba for over, 76 years. And this process and this active genocide that's going on now has even more clarified that. And so we don't have that, obviously, right? We don't have that sort of clear thing right now that like everyone can agree on. And so I do think you're right. And I would definitely, adjust some of the things I said earlier about like, or not adjust, but I would maybe more emphasize the point around clarity and a point about understanding not only what we're fighting against, but like what are our forces and what realistically can we do? And I think that's why like I sometimes, for sure I'm kind of like a soft person, right? Like I try to like be like nice and kind to people, right? And try to like give people the benefit of the doubt. Like I'm not always the most like militant rhetoric person and like being like super hard line, and I try to like see where people are coming from. But with like organizing with a lot of folks, especially a lot of the like Black African women that I organize with, who are like, yo, this shit is like, it's not about being nice, right? It's about being clear, and it's about being like principled, right? And understanding where we are. And so I think that aspect of like we really have to be clear, and we really like in that consciousness building while we recognize that we have to like be where people are at, right? So not getting in our own silos or our own like closed rooms, but like you said, we ain't even in those rooms right now too. So like how do we got to get in those buildings?
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think that's a good place to end off, honestly. Austin, I appreciate you so much for taking the time to talk with me. And I appreciate you for your writing and your organizer work as well. I'm gonna make sure I include all the writings in the show notes, and hopefully the last two installments will be out by the time this comes out. But yeah, before I let you go though, is there anything you would like to say? Shout out where folks can find you, anything you have coming up, just anything generally speaking that you would like to end this off on.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I definitely, obviously, I think these other pieces will probably be out by the time this goes out, so people can definitely check those out on Grassroots Thinking. I think check out Grassroots Thinking. They're doing a lot of good stuff. Obviously, check out Hood Communist, Black Gender Report, folks, places like Black Liberation Media, other things that, where folks can get, and where I get a lot of inspiration from. You can, a lot of the work that I do that I guess is more visible is with Black Alliance for Peace and our Haiti Americas team. So you can check that work out, and definitely look into the Red Barrial Afrodescendiente in Cuba, and see. I think there's a lot of learning learn from folks in those places, and not only thinking about nations and thinking about revolutions that happen on this grand scale, but really tapping in with the people in those places, right? In those organizations and institutions that are really struggling at a grassroots level for Black and African people, not only there, but globally. And our campaign with the Haiti America scene and with Black Alliance for Peace around the zone of peace in the Americas, people can check that out. But I think it encapsulates some of these things, and you'll probably see some repeated things that I'm even thinking about within that. But really within this idea of like, we have to be centered on the people. Obviously states are important and all this stuff is important. Geopolitics is important, but we really have to be centered on the people. And I would encourage everyone to read Song of Solomon. Obviously read Toni Morrison's Rootedness. Well, I should say I would encourage all Black African people to read Song of Solomon. And one of the things she says in there is like, pass it on, right? There's a much longer quote that I won't get into, but I think this idea of like passing it on, we need to like continue all this work and make sure we can pass it on. So I will leave there. Much appreciation to you, Josh, and to all of the work that y'all do. The Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. It really was, a joy to talk to you and hope to keep in touch. And I'm excited to keep passing on and to keep building and organizing and building our community more broadly, so we can fight and so we can struggle for liberation. Okay.
Definitely. I appreciate you so much for that. And I'm sure it won't be your last time on. So, but yeah, thank you again for coming on.